Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am your host, Liv, here with another conversation in the Euripides series. Euripides. Today's conversation is, it's only different for me, but it will seem very similar to the others to you all. But I spoke with Sean Gurd, who is at UT Austin, but who used to be at Concordia and taught me Greek tragedy like 12 years ago? Time is a flat circle. Maybe 13, actually. Weird. In any case, I spoke with Sean about ancient music broadly, or rather ancient Greek music broadly, and Euripides music specifically, because like everything else, Euripides really played with the genre, and that a lot of musical changes were happening around the time of his plays, and there was so much going on, and it's so interesting. The history of music as it gets to tragedy, is essentially like also the history of oral storytelling, right? We talk about Sappho and the evolution of the poetic meter that they were using all the way to the tragedians and to Euripides specifically. It was really fun. There's a lot of music. Some was played live in the room, and some has been inserted. So Sean was really lovely enough to provide us with two pieces that he's worked on and which were recorded at his Ancient Music and Performance Lab. And so it's really exciting. Now, neither of them are Euripides music, but it's what we had access to, and there's a lot of contextualization that goes on in the episode. And honestly, for me, it's just exciting to be able to hear a piece that is so rigorously based on what we know from the ancient world. So I was thrilled to have anything. Conversations, singing the songs of tragedy, music and Euripidean tragedy with Sean Gurd. Music in the ancient world. I'm so thrilled to hear all about it.
Okay, so where do you want to start? So it's funny. So Greek music it's very easy to say those words, but we're talking about 1,000 years of history, right?
In terms of where to start, I would love to just start at the beginning, basically what you kind of jumped into.
Okay. So
what do we know?
So the first thing is that it's the very expression ancient Greek music is a lie, because it's 1,000 years of history, probably more. If you include the Bronze Age, which I should. But but my listeners know the big gap that makes it sort of unique. But and the language changes enough that there's no sense in which I can say that I have any insight into Mycenaean culture, because I don't really read. So I just tend to pretend like it's not there. But if you include the Bronze Age, then we're talking about vast periods of time, and huge spaces. So they're Greek speakers in Turkey, right? Modern day Turkey. There's Greek speakers in Cyprus, obviously mainland Greece, all those little islands. Yeah. That's until the age of colonization. And then you've got Greek speakers in the south of Italy, Greek speakers in Sicily, Greek speakers in North Africa, even before Alexander before Alexander invaded Egypt and then forcefully settled Greek speakers in Alexandria. There were Greek speakers in Libya, there were Greek colonies down there. So there's Greeks
everywhere.
Basically, within sort of sight of the Mediterranean in all directions. And there's no high-speed communication, there's no high-speed transport, and a lot of that territory is really isolating. So mountains and islands are ideal environments for microcultures to develop, in the same way that they're ideal environments for weird species to evolve. You get individual local cultures, which I think people who live especially in North America, but I think probably anywhere in the world now, really need to stretch to imagine. Like you could live your whole life without ever leaving your valley.
Yeah. I try to emphasize that a lot with my listeners generally, like just the way the Mediterranean was so widespread and they traveled so much, but also, you know, so separate, and that there was no kind of like unified Greece at all. I think as to what you're talking about, like Sappho, you know, and Lesbos is a great example of that, because it's coming up with, I mean, just to jump right into music, and I mean, you'll get back into it, but I feel like she would be a great example because Lesbos is so far from the mainland and sort of the wider, like the more populated or popular areas where we get the Greek culture.
Yeah. No, yeah. Like, I mean, it's not like there is an exchange. Like there is musical exchange. Mm-hmm. So maybe we'll talk about it later, but there's a story that like Sappho's music is supposedly a critical ingredient in tragic music, which we can come back to. And so it does get around, and like, the language of Homer is not just one dialect. It's this this gumbo of all these different dialects. And so people are traveling, but not everybody is traveling. And, not every music is an international music, right? So like you can have international styles, which make sense in Athens and Sparta and like, Miletus and Cyprus and Mycenae. Not Mycenae. No. Cyrene. Oh, yeah. See why I got confused. Cyrene. Like you can have music that makes sense in all these places the same way that like hip hop is now an international music, or like, opera is an international rich person music or whatever, but there's also inevitably, I think it's impossible not to acknowledge that there are going to be like lots of folks doing lots of things that we would happily call music that aren't part of that international style, right? So just geographically, there's bound to be tons of variety. And then chronologically, like even if we stick to my original 1,000 years, that's basically 1066 to now. Not quite. Like we're 40 years short of 1066 to now, right? 42 years. So what happened in 10? Why do I use that as an example? 1066 is when the Normans invaded the British Isles. That's when the Normans were. William the Conqueror was a French nobleman and warlord, and he invaded England and established a new nobility and brought with him French. So that language before 1066 in the UK is highly Germanic. It's what we call Old English, right? But then we get this French overlay that happens on the language, and the language we speak now, in the most simple terms, the two founding ingredients in the that's a Canadian thing. The two founding ingredients in the English language are this Germanic Old English dialect and then French, right?
Yeah. Worlds are colliding as I studied also English literature at Concordia in Montreal at the same time period as I studied classics. Like, you're getting it all. I like it.
So between 1066 and now, the language that was spoken on the ground in the place we now call London has changed almost beyond recognition. Like you can't really read Beowulf, for example, unless you study that language. It's not available to, I mean, people would say even Chaucer, right? Really, most people can't even read Chaucer, and that's only
certainly don't want to.
So like, you should, man. Chaucer is like,
I mean, technically I have, because I do have an English degree, but I will not choose to do it again.
Really? Oh, you read the wrong parts of Chaucer.
Oh God, no. I'll stick to Euripides. Thank you.
So like and music, there's no constraint. So you can do anything with music, right? So over 1,000 years, anybody can do anything with music. So it makes, to me, it's very hard to say like, there was a Greek music and this is how the lyre was played, or this is what aulos sounded like. It's really, for me, the problem is how do we reconstruct? Like, what do we know about what do we know about the music that was made? How does the evidence sort of play into our hands? And then all of a sudden, instead of my being able to talk about Greek music, all I can give you is tiny little glimpses, like these moments when somebody happened to write for some reason about music extensively. And, so as a result, people are interested in different things at different times, and the picture is really lumpy and inconsistent, and like, it's tricky and dangerous to make broad statements about what Greek music was, but it's not totally catastrophic. Like the answer is not that we know nothing about music. We know we know a fair amount. We just can't generalize. You just have to, everything has to be sort of bracketed and carefully sort of located. And for tragedy, none of it's contemporary.
Yeah.
So the best we can do for tragic music is, well, that's not true. So it's not true that none of it's contemporary. It depends on what you mean by music. So we should probably talk about that too. But like, we don't know anything about the notes.
Right.
We know very little about the notes. So
and somebody also, like, I should say, I don't know anything about, the technical side of music at all.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
What do we know?
So, like, we do know a lot about the notes, and I will play you some of the notes so you can get a sense of like how these musics are described in later theoretical texts. But from the 5th century, when tragedy is being written, we have no contemporary observers. So the earliest observers we have for the notes, or for the sorts of things that would go into the notes, are from the 4th century. From the 4th century, we've actually got really good information. So that's good news. But there's a problem, which is that there may have been a major stylistic change between the 5th century and the 4th century.
Okay, so you do mean 4th century BC.
BCE.
Though. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But
so like,
certainly there could have been a big change.
So like the difference between, there's a danger that the music that was happening in Aeschylus and Sophocles and maybe the beginning of Euripides' career did not sound like the music that was happening at the end of Euripides' career, and that they were describing in the 4th century. So we kind of have to guess about the notes, but for rhythms, we're in really good shape because Greek music, as far as anybody knows, was basically logogenic. So logogenic music means like the rhythms come from the words.
Okay.
So you can scan, I don't remember how much Greek or Latin you did. Were
almost
you
none.
Almost none. You're in the classical civ side.
Yeah.
So basically, once you've got a sentence in Greek, every syllable, so vowel plus a few consonants, every syllable is either going to be long or short. So, and if you make the assumption, and it is an assumption, that the long syllables are 2 beats long and the short syllables are 1 beat long, every sentence has an implicit rhythm. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I just have to note, because I got distracted by Michaela, who is learning Greek right now. Just to the listener, she typed into our comments, "Oh God, scanning, my nightmare."
That's right. Scanning. You can divide the world up into people who love scanning and people who would like to quit this universe because of it. I love it. Anyway, I'm more than familiar with that reaction.
Well, I've read I can I shouldn't say I know zero Greek, but I can picture kind of what you're talking about from, what little I have played around with in terms of understanding it. And that's so interesting. Just, and certainly makes sense given we know certainly most of what we have, or I shouldn't say most, but such an enormous amount of what we have from the ancient world was sung, but we only have it written. So
right, exactly.
Yeah.
So but luckily we have the rhythms, and so you can pull it out. You have some information that way, but you don't have a ton. So just to give you an example of what we don't know. So the first line of the Iliad is main. I'm going to say this in my bad Greek. So there's an orthodox way of pronouncing Greek, which I was never taught because person who taught me Greek was a genius, certified genius, but in fact, actual genius, won a genius grant. But wow. She didn't teach us the right. Pronunciation.
Well, I hate the idea that there is a right and wrong pronunciation because it's ancient Greek. So
it's a very complicated, highly sophisticated art reconstructing pronunciation. So, and she was trained in a British tradition where they take this stuff less seriously. So I'm going to just say the first line of the Iliad. In my way, which is nobody should copy it. But the first line of the Iliad is Main and Aida Thea Pele Deo Achilleus, right? So sing the wrath goddess of Achilles, the son of Peleus. And it has a rhythm. Because you know long and shorts and you assume that long syllables are worth 2 beats, you can actually unpack the rhythm. And the rhythm is just da 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 da. And the Iliad essentially does that with variation from beginning to end. Every line has that rhythm. That's what scanning is. So we know that. That's very straightforward. The question is how are you supposed to feel that? So any rhythm, you can feel any rhythm any way you like. So that, for example, da 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 da. If I clap it at the same time, you're going to feel it in a particular way. So you ready for this? Is everybody ready? I actually have a drum right now. I'm just going to clap it.
Okay.
Okay, you ready? Da 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 da. Fairly straightforward. You could like march along to that.
Yeah.
You can imagine like the entire Iliad going like that.
Yeah.
But you can feel it in another way. Da 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 da. So what I just did was I clapped at a different like pace.
Yeah.
And it fits underneath every single line of the Iliad. No respectable classicist will tell you that the second way I clapped is how you're supposed to do it. They'll all tell you that the first way I clapped is how you're supposed to do it. But nonetheless, there it is. There's another way to clap, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know. We don't know which one. We actually don't know which one was used, or maybe both were used, or maybe some people use the one, some people use the other. It's not like there's no documentary evidence for how you feel the line. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like you have, I don't know, some hip hop lyric, but you don't have anything but the hip hop lyric.
Right.
So
yeah, because you can speak those things to different rhythms, right, or sing them to different rhythms. Yeah.
So that's like that's the information is gappy at best. Mm-hmm. And that, for me, that what that means is there's like we have tons of fun.
Yeah.
With that, because we can do anything we like.
So I just have a question based on, because I obviously come at this entirely from, the text themselves, and also, as I said, from like an English background. So I'm reminding everyone that these things are sung, but I'm never really imagining them that way. But like when it comes to the Homeric tradition, I imagine this rhythm was serving to like help the bards remember the lines and things. Do we know that, or do we think, one came before the other, or?
Yeah, I mean, so there's I want to be careful here. So it's really important to be able to distinguish between what's reasonable speculation and what's not reasonable speculation. So
fair.
The reasonable speculation. So, starting in the early 20th century, guys like Perry and, it was Perry, and then people have done this all over the world now, went out and like found oral poets who were living and working and singing epic poems. And they're, all over the world, there are epic poems. They seem to, one of the things that they seem to evince is a connection between form and story, so that the form helps you tell the story. It doesn't help you remember the words, because often, like oral poets, their performances aren't exactly word for word the same every time. They're close. Right. But you're kind of making up the words, and you're fitting them into these pre-established formal elements. So the rhythm is there as a constraint. The rhythm in the words is there to help you craft your tale in a particular way. It's not, I don't think it's right to call it a memory aid. Like, it doesn't help you remember the story. It just helps you, it gives you a shape to put it in. That's right. It's like, people who can talk in iambic pentameter.
Yeah.
They can just talk in iambic pentameter, and everything just get like, have you ever met somebody who can talk in iambic pentameter? So you take that, and then on top of that, you get the rhythm, and then you sing also. So there's a melody on top of that. Yeah. So what we don't know is, for Homer, we don't know how they sung. So what we know is, I need to get a guitar now. I can't. Okay. So what we know for Homer from art, like, archaic, really pre-classical images of people holding lyres, and we call those lyres forminges. It's a forminx. And they have usually 5 strings. Sometimes 4. But the sort of shorthand is to say that it's a 5-string lyre. And so normally you tune a lyre like a scale. So the notes are close to each other. Can you hear that, by the way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So if you have 5 strings, you maybe have 5 notes. And the question is, which 5 notes do you have? And it turns out there's a widespread scale. It's called the pentatonic scale. So a pentatonic scale is just a scale with 5 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right? Or it could be. Those 2 things are actually pretty much the same scale. So we can imagine Homer being sung just with those 5 notes. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a bunch of them, but so may na e da fe or something. I don't know, something like that. But that's a guess.
I mean, it's nice anyway.
Of course, yeah, it's lovely. I mean, it's people who sing Homer usually sing it with what's called a pentatonic scale, and some of them sing it with a major pentatonic scale, and some of them sing it with a minor pentatonic scale. There are different kinds of pentatonic scales. That's highly technical. But like ultimately, what's happening there is that we're looking at the lyres, like we're looking at these archaic instruments. We're seeing that they have 5 strings, or mostly have 5 strings, and then we're concluding that it's a 5-note scale that the Iliad and the Odyssey were sung to originally. So eventually, of course, people were still singing the Iliad and the Odyssey when they were holding 11-string lyres, and then like it's anybody's guess what was happening musically at that point. Right. But like in the earliest phase, the most quote unquote creative phase of the tradition, it seems that it was a 5-string lyre, and it seems like a fair conclusion. Like something like that is the sound, or it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Obviously not quite like that, but that gives you the idea.
Yeah.
Of the sound.
So then, is that kind of what we know in terms of the instruments too? Like that, that archaic depiction you were talking about, is that kind of the earliest that we know of, or?
No, I mean, there's really old lyres, right? So that in Ur, there are these tombs in Ur.
Oh,
like
wow.
It's Sumerian, like, Ur, like the, and I'm not up on this scholarship on this, but there are these massive tombs, and they seem to be like, they're always called royal burial sites, and whoever it was that was dead got company. So the person who was buried was also buried with 20 or 30 other people, and who I don't know how they ended up, like, I really don't know. Somebody knows, not me, when they died exactly in this process. But they're buried with many, many bodies, and some of those people were musicians, and so in those tombs there are lyres, beautiful lyres. So there's something called the bull lyres or they're these big.
I can picture it.
Yeah, you can Google it. I mean, they're gorgeous works of art, and who knows for how long they were played, or if they were just built to be buried, or like what. But it's super old, and there's a kind of a continuous tradition of instruments, both actual instruments and in art, and then we get occasional glimpses, like in ancient Near Eastern music, right up to the historical period of like liturgies. There's a musical notation. Nobody fully understands the musical notation, but seems basically that we're able to reconstruct it, and then it's used. So there's there are these things called the Hurrian hymns, which can be played, and you can get recordings of them that are on cuneiform tablets.
Oh, wow.
So, like, Greek music, in terms of the history of music, is actually pretty late.
Right. I mean, I should have assumed that the Sumerians or someone like that was doing it first. They did most things first in that area.
But what's amazing is that, there's data. Like, of course, there was music the minute somebody could. There's a great guy, Gary Tomlinson, wrote a book called A Million Years of Music, and a couple other things more recently, in which he has a thesis that, like, musical practice drives parts of human evolution through, like, sexual selection. That's not particularly interesting or relevant here. What is that?
No, but I mean, it sounds like an interesting phrase, at least. So I was in.
Like, it is kind of thing like we are the way we are because there was music before there were humans, is, I think.
That's lovely
of describing it. And one of the things he describes, which I just think is so beautiful. I mean, I have no idea whether it's true or not. This is well outside of my expertise, but flint knapping, so making flint tools, basically involves hitting one piece of flint with another piece of flint, right? And that, I think we know, is happening before Homo sapiens appears. So it's a very, very old practice. But when you hit one stone with another, how do you do it? Like, do you do it like this? Or do you do it like this? And if you're hitting one stone against another one like that, you're creating a regular beat.
Yeah.
So that's music, right? And if there's somebody next to you, let's say your 5-year-old kid, pre-Homo sapiens hominin kid, is sitting beside you watching and copying everything you do, and you're doing it like this, your kid is going to be able to sync up with that and learn how to make flint tools, right? Like that, syncing up with a regular rhythm is a thing that crickets can do. So definitely hominids can do it. And his suggestion is that musical practice of having a regular rhythm actually ensures cultural continuity, because your kid can learn how to make the tool that is crucial for the community's survival.
Oh, that's really interesting.
So that's like in no way relevant to Euripides.
So yeah, like what do we know about, maybe theatrical music generally, if you want, but I know specifically there is Euripides. So
yeah, right. So let's talk about theater music, and then we'll talk about what we know about Euripides. That's tricky. So knowing how much of what's in Euripides is different. We know some things mostly because we have the rhythms, and then the rest of it is kind of like guessing. It's like highly well-informed guessing.
I mean, that's most of
and
history.
I should say that I feel a little doubtful about some of the things I'm going to say, although nothing I'm going to say isn't mainstream.
Okay.
Musical historians. So like tragedy itself is a weird form. There's in music, like in Greek music, there's stuff like Homer, and then there's stuff like Sappho. So Homer is a single rhythm that goes, for thousands of lines. Sappho is verses, so it's a longer, more complicated verse, like rhythm that gets repeated. And then in the 6th century, at some point, about the time that tragedy was being cooked up, you get this thing called a triadic form, where you have 2 verses that have the same rhythm, and then a third verse that has a different rhythm, and then you can repeat that over and over and over again. And that's normally associated with the like Dorian speakers. So the Greek, like there's not just the same way there's not one Greek music, there's not one ancient Greek. So like when you study ancient Greek in university, most people, unless you're doing it like in a theology program, you're probably either starting with Attic Greek. Probably almost everybody these days starts with Attic Greek, which is the Greek that was written in Athens by the big names in the 4th century: Plato, Demosthenes, Socrates, Aristotle. Or you taught Homeric Greek. So one of those two you're taught. But there's all kinds of other dialects, and there's a major dialect which is called Doric, which is what Pindar wrote in. Lots of poets wrote in Doric, and it was not spoken by people in Athens. It was spoken by people in Sparta and their colonies. So like Syracuse mostly was Doric, South Italy mostly was Doric, and that doesn't exhaust it. There's also Aeolic, like Sappho's dialect is different. So tragedy, which was cooked up. Let's just say it was institutionalized in Athens, is written in 2 dialects. So Homer's written in its own thing. Like Homeric Greek is its own thing. It's not probably a language that anybody spoke. But tragedy is in 2 poetized versions of dialects. At least this is what we think. One is an Attic Ionic, so like the local Athenian version of this bigger dialectal group called Ionic, and the other one is Doric, which is the language that's spoken in the Peloponnese and around Sparta. So that's already like, for an art form, that's already a little bit strange, right? It's like writing a play where half the play's in English and the other half's in French. Or, better, half the play's in American English and the other half the play's in British English.
Right. Or like Shakespearean or versus something else. Yeah.
Right. But there's no pretense that the people speaking in the people using the Doric language are actually from a Doric part of town. It's just the form imposes that. And then, so it's even more complicated than that, because it turns out that all the spoken parts are in Attic, and all the sung parts are kind of in a fake Doric.
Like across the board, or like commonly?
Yeah.
Wow.
And there's like signatures, so the vowels are different. So you get alphas instead of betas. So like it's like it really is. I think actually the best comparison is like American English and British English.
Mm-hmm.
So like they're talking in American English, and when they start singing, they're singing British English, which it sounds really weird and counterintuitive, but it's actually not if you happen, as I do, to be 50. So Gen Xers grew up listening to pop music that mostly came from London.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like really, it was like in the late 70s and the early 80s, the really cool music was all coming from the UK, the Smiths, the Jam, like the Cure. Like singers, and actually I was like this too. I have some recordings of me singing when I was, which nobody will ever hear, some recordings of me singing when I was like 16, and also of other bands that I was in with singers. And we sang with this weird fake British accent. Like we sang rock and roll tunes with this weird fake British accent. And I don't think we were even doing it on purpose.
No, because you're singing the songs.
Right. Yeah. Like the music was coming from over there. Everything we were hearing was being pronounced in this. So, and you'll hear like, I'm not saying this. I'm not saying that like occasionally you hear Canadian rock bands singing with American accents. Like I'm not saying that ever happens, but if you notice it, if you happen to notice a Canadian rock band where everybody sounds like they're from Tennessee, you'll understand what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking of, I'm based on that alone, like God Save the Queen, the Sex Pistols is playing in my head, and you can so hear the accent in that. Like
absolutely, yeah. And like so it doesn't like it's not actually that strange. Like there's a kind of a musical style that's associated with the Dorian parts of the Greek world, and then there's a musical style that's associated with the Ionian parts of the Greek world, and they put them together in tragedy.
Yeah.
And then
I'm thinking of it now as a movie, actually, just to like, Lord of the Rings is all that's coming to me, but like they're speaking, a lot of them are fairly British English or American, and like they're blending it together. So right. Like,
why in
fantasy is what makes
not-
it weird, but yeah.
Well, but it's like there's a generic association. Like, why do they? Where does Tolkien say they have British accents?
Yeah, he sure does not. And also, like, Frodo has an American accent, so we're all just mixing it up.
Yeah, like in Roman, like what they used to call, what do they call them? Sand and sandal epics.
Oh, sword and sandal
epics, right? The heroes always had American accents, and the bad aristocrats always had British accents.
I mean, Achilles' accent in Troy is definitely just spot on.
So that's like the first thing about tragedy is they're like mixing those two dialects together. And we have this, but weirdly enough, like they didn't sing the Attic Ionic stuff was spoken, and the music was like the sung stuff was in this fake Doric.
Mm-hmm.
We have exactly one piece of information about the notes that they sang. It's not very good information, but it's exactly one. It comes from the 4th century, and it is that tragic music combined Dorian music, like the Dorian mode, with the Mixolydian mode, and the Dorian mode comes from like the Peloponnese, it's manly and warlike, and the Mixolydian mode is Sappho's mode of music, and it's good for desire and grief. So if you think about tragedy as being an art form that combines manly heroism with grief, that actually comes pretty close to like what. Like that's the feeling of tragedy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's lovely.
So there are these two, and then they took these two combinations of notes or pitch sets or pitch styles. One which was presumably from what they called the Dorian, presumably has some connection with Spartan culture of some kind, and the other one comes from Sappho and it's called the Mixolydian. I'm trying to think of what's like. It's hard for us to think about this because modern music is either really, really way out there or really, really simple, because you have major and minor, so it's not really the same. But a music that's able to like communicate different feelings with different scales. Mm-hmm. So that's like, and I can tell you that I think we know what those scales were.
Okay.
Do you want to hear them?
Obviously.
Okay. Oh man, it's so much fun to have all the guitars here when I'm doing this. It's like just one stupid little
but
lyre.
No
I don't know how they did this without guitars. But actually, the word guitar is an ancient Greek word, right?
No, please tell me how. I probably actually will have remembered it when you.
At this point, you're probably wishing we were just like slagging famous Oxford scholars or whatever we were doing last time we talked.
I mean, we can always do that too. But no, I love this. I do want. I honestly I like to know every single Greek word that I come upon. So I'm very serious when I tell you to tell me, please.
So the fully developed big concert lyre. That you see, like if you look at a vase painting, any vase painting that has just a singer holding a lyre and nothing else in the scene, the lyre is like big and angular, and that's called a kithara.
My brain connected the kithara just before, as soon as you said it, I was like, oh, kithara sounds like it could be guitar.
Yeah, so kithara, so there's a whole bunch of instruments all over that have the tar sound in them. So like guitar in India, there's sitar.
Right.
There's actually an instrument that's used in the Middle East, which is called the tar. Huh. Just the tar, and it's the second syllable of kithara. Yeah. So guitar is kithar, right?
Yeah.
And the rest of them, like sitar, is changed the first syllable, but tar is just the thar part.
Oh, I love that. See, I legitimately love etymological stuff like that so much.
Cool. Unfortunately, a guitar is not built like a kithara. It has a neck. There were ancient Greek guitars, now that I think about it, but they weren't called kitharas. It was called a duris. Mm. So somehow the kithara name got attached to lute type instruments. But anyway, so what was I talking about? Oh yeah, Dorian music. Here's what the Dorian scale sounds like. So I needed to change guitars because Greek music was microtonal.
Okay. So, what is that?
You ready?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Okay, so I'm going to play just some regular scale.
Okay.
Let's go. Here's a regular scale. Oh, this guitar is not in tune. Okay, that's close enough. Okay. There's a regular scale. So there's really only two intervals in that whole scale. Tones and semitones. So I don't know if you can hear the difference between this and this. Mm-hmm. The first one's bigger than the second one, right?
Yeah.
But there's smaller intervals. Can you hear that? The difference in those two? So these are hard to hear. You have to be good at listening for them. But you can have semitones, which is like half. This is a tone. And there's semitones, which is half of a tone. And then there can be quarter tones. Not quite a semitone. So Greek music had a lot of freedom with its tiny little pitch, like its tiny little intervals. So sometimes it could be a tone or a semitone or a quarter tone. And
so intricate.
Yeah, it is. And you have to have really good ears to hear it. But these modes that tragedy supposedly used, the Dorian and the Mixolydian from Sappho and from Peloponnese or something, are microtonal scales. So the Dorian is this. That's it. I'll play it again because it's really weird. Yeah. It doesn't sound like it's in tune, right? So I'll do it again. in a different octave. Maybe I can do it somewhere else, make it easier to hear. Oh, I didn't get the chord of it. So that is supposed to be the music of courage, warlike, heroic feeling. I know it doesn't sound like much. Because I'm very bad at it, but you can imagine somebody practicing that over and over and over again for their whole life. They could get pretty good at that.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, the sound.
It is, yeah, and it's those tiny little. There's tiny little intervals, and there's really big ones, right?
Yeah.
Actually, yes. Well, we'll come back to that. So that's the Dorian, and here's the Sappho. According to this is a 4th century source. The music that Sappho used had the following scale, and it's close, but it's not quite the same.
Okay.
I'll play it again. So again, there's quarter notes. I don't know if you can hear those.
Yeah.
And then there's a huge interval at the end. It actually covers an octave. So you got to that poem about he seems like a god to me. The Sappho poem being sung to that like. Yes. Well, now you understand why there's a lyre, because I'm like killing my hand to get those weird tiny little pitches out.
I mean, I am obsessed with all of that. Thank you. I'm going to be picking all
it's really like, it's very, and I can totally hear it as like, if you think about what happens in tragedy, these kind of haunting, unstable melodies seem right for it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, they like absolutely fit. I'm really into it.
In fact, actually, I was kind of, I didn't think we'd get to this, but we actually have 2 pieces of papyrus with music on them.
Yeah.
Tiny little fragments of papyrus with music on them. And one of them's from Euripides' Orestes, the other one's from the Iphigenia Aulos, both very, very late plays. And the papyri themselves are from several centuries later, and probably, my guess is, aren't Euripidean, but the melody for one of them is that. You can hear those. It has those tiny little intervals in it. It's like he's dwelling on it. Like he wants you to hear. It's not like 3 notes. It's like 2 very unstable, bendy notes. And so it could, like, to me, that sounds kind of haunted.
Yeah.
I'm sure you could be very, very precise about it, but to me, it sounds really sort of haunted and weird. And that's exactly right. Like, that's tragedy, right?
Which piece was that? Which play?
It's the Orestes.
It was the Orestes one, okay. I love that so much. I mean, yeah, it feels like it just suits it all so perfectly, and of course, because it does. But it really does just like give you all of those wonderfully weird kind of tragic vibes, especially Euripides.
Yeah. So I'm playing a guitar, right?
Yeah.
So guitars are very limited instruments. I can only lyres too. I can really only play notes. I'm trying to think like I can get some sounds.
Ooh.
Right. I can do that. I can do like on it. But there's not like, it's basically notes. I can I can like make things slide around a little bit. But it's notes. Tragedy was not done with a lyre. Certainly wasn't done with a guitar, but it wasn't done with a lyre, right? It was done with a pair of aulos. So they would have a chorus, and then they'd have an aulos play. So I gave you recordings, and this is where you have to drop them in. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Can you tell the listeners like a bit about what an aulos is? Because it's not really something I've talked about before.
Yeah. Okay. So it's like it's a tube. It's a tube with some holes in it down the side, like a recorder. But instead of a recorder's mouthpiece, there's nothing, and you have to stick in basically a reed that's been flattened. So if anybody's ever played an oboe or a bassoon, they'll have a sense of it's that kind of a mouthpiece. It's a flattened reed. It's very complicated. It takes years to make one of these reeds. We have a really good description actually of how ancient Greeks made these reeds, and it was a years-long process because you got to cut them at the right time, and then you have to cure them, and then it's very sophisticated art making these reeds. They're very loud. They're very reedy, and then because they're so simple, you can you don't just play notes on the aulos. You can bend them and bend notes, and you can make glides, and you can make squeaking sounds, and there's all kinds of sort of sound effects that you can do on an aulos. So that one of the recordings you got from me is of actually a bassoonist, Johnathan Churchett. I gave him one of my sets of alloy and some mouthpieces and said, see what you can do with this. And he figured out how to play them. And then I explained to him about this piece of music, which is called the Pythian Gnome, which is from probably the first performance of it was in the 6th century BCE, and then it became sort of standard repertoire. And it was a piece of music that told the story of the battle between Apollo and the snake that occupied the site at Delphi. So Apollo turns up at Delphi, and there's already a snake living there, and he fights it and kills it and takes it over, and it becomes Delphi, which is his oracle. there's this piece of aulos music which tells the story of that fight. And if you listen to the recording, you can kind of hear the parts. So there's like an introduction, and then you can hear like the snake moving along the ground, and then Apollo challenges it to a fight, and then there's actually a fight. If you like, it gets faster and more tense, and there's sort of two melodies happening simultaneously, and then there's a big climax, and then the snake dies right at the end, and there's this horrible sound, which is this supposed to be the snake like breathing out its last breath, and that sound is called the serigmos, which just means hissing. And so, and like, there's a lot of discussion about how do you get the serigmos sound on an aulos, and what was it? And so Jonathan's version is right at the end of that recording of the Pythian gnome that you've got. But if you listen to everything he does in there, he doesn't just play notes. Like, he plays notes, and he plays really virtuosically. I mean, I think he very quickly became one of the greatest aulos players in the world. I think he deserves to be taken very seriously as a specialist on that instrument just after a year on it. There's others that are great, but he just discovered all kinds of cool stuff.
Oh, that's exciting.
And he's able to bend notes, and like, he creates these very eerie, scary sounds. And that's all stuff an aulos can do that a lyre or a guitar just can't do. So that's the sound of the instrumentalist, like, accompaniment to tragedy. So that when people are singing, those are the sounds that are happening at the same time. So, like, I'm not sure pretty is the right word for tragic music.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's like interesting, certainly.
Yeah.
But I do like, I mean, I'm like a little goth girl at heart. And so I just love the idea that it was just, spooky. And I'm picturing it, alongside certainly the Orestes. It's so cool that that's one of the ones we have some kind of notation for, because like, what a play. Yeah. It's in the lost recording, we'll call it, you talked about Euripides possibly being kind of innovative in the field of music. Like, is there some can you tell us about that?
Something happened in the second half of the 5th century, and like, this is where I have to admit I'm a little nervous, because I'm not sure I believe the standard story, but I'll tell you the standard story. Something happened in the second half of the 5th century, and it was a bunch of things sort of simultaneously. A lot of these things did happen. Like, a lot of these things really did happen. It's the question of how innovative the music was as a result that I'm not sure we actually have solid evidence for. But like, actors started to get paid. Mm-hmm. So you actually got like you got the development of a professional class of tragic actors. So the choruses were still citizen choruses, but they would hire, their protagonists would be hired in. So they would hire the aulos player in from Thebes. That's where all the alloy musicians came from. This very famous guy called Pronomus, an aulos player from Thebes. And the actors seem to have been Athenian, but they received payment for their performances in the tragedy. And so one of my teachers, actually, at the University of Toronto, called Eric Chapo, lives, I don't know where he is now. He was in Australia for a long time. He sort of guessed that once they were being paid, that allowed for the creation of really professionals, right? So if you actually can make money off of making your music, then you don't have to have a day job anymore. Mm-hmm. You can just kind of focus on it. And so he figured that the level of play rose very quickly in the second half of the 5th century BCE, when Euripides was like in his maturity. Right. And he was able to work with singers who had chops that Aeschylus didn't. Yeah. And as a result, he could make much more complicated, much more interesting music, and that led to his pushing the envelope. It's pushing the envelope like rhythmically and also harmonically, like in terms of his melodies. it's clear that he wasn't the only person doing this. There seems to have been musical innovation happening elsewhere as well in the second half of the 5th century BC. What's really interesting is that, like, if you wanted me to guess, I would say most of it's happening in the Ionian Greek part of the world.
Okay.
So the reason that's
really,
interesting is because, like, remember I said tragedy's got two dialects in it, 2 poetic dialects. One is Ionic Attic, and the other one is like Doric.
Yeah.
And the Doric is the musical part.
Yeah. Yeah. So then Ionic. And do you mean like quite far east or
like
just...
like Miletus?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So east.
East. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I, quite a few, not all, but quite a few of the people we know about who were innovators in the second half of the 5th century were coming from the East, like the Greek East rather than the Greek West. Mm-hmm. And Euripides seems to have picked up on this and incorporated it into his music, or contributed to it, or was part of this general movement of some kind of musical innovation. So once again, like, the evidence for the notes is really bad, but we have the rhythms, and that's how you can tell that Euripides is innovating. So there's what happens in Euripides that you don't get, for example, you do get it, but you don't get it anywhere near as much, is Euripides has solo song. So he has what we call monody, where an actor just sings. Mm-hmm. So like the opening of the Ion, for example, when he comes in, he's on his own and he's singing.
Yeah.
Or there's this fantastic scene in the Orestes, which was like my favorite play and everybody's favorite play in antiquity, when a Phrygian slave comes over a wall, comes running out of the house. Over a wall is my imagination. It's not actually, it's just the way I picture it in my head. Comes out of the house to tell the story of this like attack on, I think it's Helen, right? Mm-hmm. And that scene, it's a messenger speech basically, but it's not a messenger speech. Messenger speeches are always in iambic trimeter and they're always spoken. That scene is sung by a single actor who delivers this like virtuosic musical narrative that also probably somehow imitates. So Phrygian is Greek, slightly racist short form for somebody who's not Greek from the Far East, like from the Middle East, the non-Greek Middle East. Yeah,
so we're still thinking of East with that too. Like,
So you can just look and you can see he has more music for solo singers, more music for 2 actors rather than an actor and a chorus, and actually less music for choruses. So Aeschylus has these long choral passages, or there will be a duet between a chorus and a single singer in Aeschylus. In Euripides, you could have a single singer just singing. Mm-hmm. Or
I didn't know that was a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to see that, you really do need to be able to. I mean, we infer that from the type of rhythm. I mean, we make these basic inferences, like we assume that it's sung if it has a lyric meter, which is
right.
Particular kind of rhythm, and so you can see when they're singing, and then you see that it's just an actor singing, and chorus isn't part of it, which is pretty cool. So he was clearly doing stuff with performers that much like musical stuff with performers that was happening less extensively in older, like in Aeschylus, basically.
Right.
And so that seems to be a real sign of some kind of musical innovation that's going on. And then on top of that, we project all this other stuff about this at some point. So those scales I played you, they are really weird, right? Mm-hmm. But at some point, Greek scales got a lot more like what we recognize. So a basic Greek scale from the 4th century was this. Do that again. And that's not quite. So most people who don't have a great deal of musical training probably hear that as it's still a little bit weird. But it's not anywhere near as weird as what I was playing before, because it doesn't have the right.
Yeah. I mean, I have zero musical training, and I can tell it's definitely like not weird, or like the other one is being weirder is definitely the best way to describe it.
So you get a movement from like this maybe you get a movement from this like haunted, very tiny little intervals to something that could almost be flamenco.
Yeah.
And like that seems to have, it's the chronology that's really tricky and hard to establish, but it looks like the best candidate for when that happened. The first phase of that was probably second half of the 5th century, late second half of the 1st century. So that by the time we get music theory in the 4th century BCE, what they're describing is actually basically music that could be Mozart. I mean, it couldn't be Mozart, but it's this, it's like on a continuum that connects to Mozart. There's no way that anybody was writing anything like Mozart, I think. But they're using this. There's the same basic approach to musical material, at least for the people that the theorists are describing. So, like, and to us, like, I think to us, it sounds like they went from this weird, unsettling music to this very normal sounding music. But the evidence is that 4th century people who heard it, like Plato, heard exactly the opposite. What they heard was like destructive innovation.
Yeah, well, that's unsurprising.
So like these like really simple, well, for Plato, everything's destructive and all innovation is just right. So yeah, that's true. But there's also like, there's also people who just all theater music was terrible and what they seem to be pointing to who was just exactly the musical developments that make these music sound to us
more
accessible.
Yeah, that's so interesting. They're hating it. That is
like
unsurprising.
it's like the squarest music you can imagine is actually ultra hip punk stuff. So like,
well, I mean, I feel like it's like, as somebody who was a kid in the 90s and teen in the 2000s, like the complaints about our music from the older generation, and that's happened all throughout history. So it sounds like just like that, like all the new kids in their tunes. Oh my,
noise, just
regular
noise,
music.
Noise.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know if Euripides was part of the tonal innovation or not, but I think it's a fair, if somebody wanted to make that argument, I wouldn't say they were wrong. That's the sort of the standard theory, is that there's this new approach to tonal material, like to scales and the notes you use, developed that very rapidly in the 4th century became the standard one. So that already by the second half of the 4th century BCE, there's a guy called Aristoxenus who was a music theorist, wrote about music, and he said that like people couldn't hear those tiny little quarter tone intervals that I was trying to play on the guitar. He said people couldn't hear them anymore because they weren't being exposed to them. So he thought they existed, but people, like what he said was that I say these scales exist and people say they don't. And then his explanation is, and the reason for that is they're no longer being exposed to that kind of music. So it just like kind of disappears somehow and becomes mostly a theoretical.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, this is all generally so interesting. Do we know, I mean, I guess probably the answer is we just don't know any of this, but when it comes to, the idea of of Euripides innovating the music, like it seems to me, and this might just be because I'm his biggest fan, that, because he was pretty innovative in a lot of things. Like he was really kind of pushing the envelope and just doing slightly different things, from what we know of as of Aeschylus and Sophocles. Like, would music kind of fit into that, or was it more likely that he was just kind of around for this time of innovation and taking part in it?
Yeah, I mean, that is exactly the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so like, I mean, one of the things that I like about Euripides, so I for years have taught Euripides as like a disruptor, like somebody who sort of has an avant-garde approach to the art, which is why I plays like the Electra. Like the Electra, Euripides' Electra is just is discombobulating from beginning to end. It like you're nothing but surprised by it. So it's the third. We have 3 plays about Electra, right? And the first 2, Aeschylus's version and Sophocles' version, are both set in the same place. They both have basically the same structure. They have the same setup. And then you get Euripides' Electra, and it's set in a completely different place. It has different characters. Everything about it is different. It ends differently. It doesn't have like things that you expect. And he seems to be constantly just trying to get in your face with these innovations, right? And he's not the only play like that. The Orestes is obviously like that. It's both ridiculously revisionist and also theatrically bombastic, and it just seems like he's identified what everybody expects and is deliberately doing the opposite. And that's how I love that Euripides, and I love Euripides as that playwright. But he's also sometimes fanatically balanced. Like everything, it's not just loud guitars blasting at you all the time. There's something pretty in there at the same time. So it's sometimes in really clear ways. So like sometimes in really obvious ways, he's highly balanced. So, like the Heracles starts as a little, it's almost a quasi-comic plot. Heracles comes home and his wife and kids are being oppressed by a local tyrant, and Heracles comes home and rescues them, right? Seems like it. And there's a happy ending. Halfway through the play, there's a happy ending. Oh, it's slightly more than halfway through the play, but there's a happy ending. And then the second half of the play happens. And in the second half of the play, Heracles kills his own family in a state of madness that's been brought on by this goddess Iris, who's been sent by Hera, who hates Heracles, right? Yeah. So, that's a play in which Euripides has a kind of a up comedy followed by one of the most unremittingly dark narratives anybody has ever written, ever. And he's put them together, and they in a way, I think the point there is that they balance each other out.
Yeah.
Which is not what you expect from tragedy. So on the one hand, he's still disrupting, right? He's still hacking your expectations. But he's not he's not just breaking everything, or I think in some ways it's a bit like if there's a move from this weird, unsettling and harmonic music to something a little sweeter and more stable and more like what we recognize, and everybody hears that as disruptive. He's doing the same thing with his plots.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right?
I mean, well, that's what I love about him, and there are so many examples of that. But you're right. He does it's disruptive, but it is, it's balanced as well. It's also just that, or I take it rather as it's just a testament to his skill, is that he wasn't trying to fuck things up just for the sake of it, just to kind of make the quote unquote older generation or whatever it is, make them uncomfortable. He was also really honing his art alongside making these really interesting and odd decisions. Like the way you described the Heracles reminds me of the Alcestis, which to me feels like it's kind of balanced in that way too, where it's really Admetus throughout is pretty ridiculous. He's kind of just over the top and all of these things, and meanwhile Alcestis is really reserved, and you get this seemingly happy ending, and it is fairly kind of balanced in its levels of ridiculousness and real human emotion. Alcestis with her children and all of these things, and that's what I like about him generally, is that it's never straight tragedy. There's always something interesting that he's doing, or playing around with characters, or just I recently for the show spoke with Toph Marshall, who talked about the kind of innovative things he was doing with plot, and or just how he trying to cement a kind of canon idea when it comes to a myth. Antigone having a baby, and then the other was Oedipus showing up to Thebes already blind. The way he kind of played with these things and sort of pushed into a realm that people weren't necessarily expecting. And so it just feels to me like music would fit in with that so well if he was also there's maybe a new technology or this kind of innovative in terms of, like you were saying, the quality, because people are getting paid. It just makes so much sense that he would kind of capitalize on that idea and use it to innovate his music alongside, all the other things he's doing.
Yeah, so to me, that makes a lot of sense. And I think we can, if that's what he's doing. So like I have, on the one hand, I want to say, well, there's just an aesthetic here. Like there's just here's how you enjoy Euripides. You see, you need to develop the ability to appreciate the way he is working with your expectations to do something really like tasty and chewy and compelling.
Yeah.
Like, have you ever read Infinite Jest? Don't say yes. Nobody says yes to that question.
I would never say yes. I'm very proud to say no.
Okay, it's too damn long, right? The reason I've never made it through that book is actually not that it's too long, but that the sentences are too. Every sentence is something happens in every single sentence in Infinite Jest. It's too much stuff happening, so that like I know when I tried to read it, I was exhausted by page 4 because there was just like I was just way too engaged. There was no context in which I was going to be able to keep it up. It was like being forced to eat cake all the time. It was way too rich and way too engaging. I don't think Euripides like that, but I think it's the same sort of thing in the sense that you're always like you're pulled in by something being slightly off, and that keeps it like it gives it an incredible amount of traction with your intention, with your attention. So like on the one hand, that's just a trick. Like anybody can do that. That's just an aesthetic thing. But I want to ask like, well, where did that come from? Why is he able to do that? And I think maybe one answer for that is that he's mixing, like he's bringing in, like he's mixing with, like he's innovating at the level of plot, but he's also working with all of these elements that are out there in Greek culture, and he puts them together in different ways. So there's a thing called the Taftag. There was a thing that was really big in the 90s called choral projection.
I don't.
So this is so there's no such thing as a tragic choral ode. It's not a genre. It's a form, but it's not a genre. So it has has a particular shape that it has to have, rhythmic rules or whatever. I mean, there's tons of freedom in there, but there's a basic sort of rhythmic and narrological form that a choral ode has, but it doesn't have a genre. And the reason I can say that is because they present themselves as different genres. Like sometimes they're wedding hymns, and sometimes they're binding hymns in some songs, and sometimes they're like paeans, like hymns to Apollo. So it doesn't like a choral ode can be anything its author wants it to be. It can announce itself to be any other genre. So like in that sense, tragedy is a little bit like a novel. Like novels are, a novel is not a thing. A novel is anything you want it to be. You can write a novel as a series of emails, or you can write a novel as a series of texts. You can write a novel. I have a friend who has a word tattooed on his body. He's part of a novel. There was an artist in the 2000s who was putting a novel on volunteers' bodies. So her work is out there. It's just
I love that.
Right? So like a novel doesn't have, it has a form in the sense that it's some sort of large scale narrative work, but it doesn't have a genre. And in fact, its whole point is it can be any old genre. You have a novel in verse. Right? So, and I think like tragedy has that generic instability or that generic openness, so you can bring in all kinds of material. And maybe like the reason Euripides is able to do this, make things so interesting, is because he's a really good mixologist. Like he knows when a paean is going to go well set against. So let's just imagine that the son of a woman who was raped by Apollo is working at the temple to Apollo, and he's, the product of extraordinary divine violence. How do you bring him on? Other than singing a hymn to Apollo. Right? And that, like the setup there, and that when he comes on. So the setup there is so unbelievably ironic, and it's because he set this person up in a particular way, and then he comes in and he does a totally recognizable thing, which is sing a hymn to Apollo. But because of who he is, that recognizable thing, it just grabs you and it holds you, because there's something like non-grammatical there that's happening. And as a result, you're just totally compelled. And that is like, it's like he's using the song genre, the style of the paean, to set up an enormous amount of tension that's just going to sort of play out throughout the whole play. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The Ion is such a good example for that too, because it really is like, I only read that for the first time in the last year, and it just blew my mind in every possible way. And seeing it like that with just the entrance by singing that hymn to Apollo, really, I mean, it makes the play even more impressive. I'm just kind of trying to remember whether my translation, noted that it was sung, because that's the problem with so many of these things. I have to say, actually, specifically because you were mentioning Orestes and Electra and everything, that I'm not sure how much I've talked about it on the show, but because, and we kind of have that lost version of our conversation, but for the listeners, you taught me Greek drama, tragedy, I forget what the class was called, like 10 plus years ago. And this very specifically memorable thing was that the plays we covered was all of the various Orestes, Electra plays, Agamemnon, but by all of the three tragedians, because we have such great examples of them all writing it and looking at the ways that everyone did that. But also that I think we had to like piece apart each part of the play and like kind of break down what kind of, whether it was a monody or a parados or whatever all the different terms are. And it's helpful to look at it that way and to kind of be able to see that. But so often when you're just picking up a translation that doesn't give you that information, and it's so vital, though. It adds so much context when we understand what's kind of going on in terms of performance, because that's the thing that's so easily lost when it comes to Greek tragedy.
And I think that's, so you really do, like, the translations are really different in this, like, depending on what, I think the translation we were using, at least for some of the plays, maybe for the Euripides, I don't remember for the other one, but some of them were using different fonts for sung and spoken bits. I don't know if maybe that was not, I think eventually I settled on translations that used, like, where you could actually see typographically what was sung and what was spoken, but some of the differences in font were extremely subtle. Like, it was not good typography. Like, you could sort of tell if you really looked carefully that some of the letters were slanted a little bit.
Right, yeah.
But it was not like, really hyper. But yeah, mostly you've got to go in and look at the Greek and scan it if it's not, if you're not being told right up front but then so like the other thing is that song genres, like the difference between singing and speaking is mostly a difference in rhythm, but identifying genres based on what people say. So there's not like there are little signatures, like, you hear little cries that are typical of different genres, like EA paean is something you say when you're singing a paean, and there's similar things for dithyrambs, which are sacred to Dionysus. But for the most part, it's just they have like a set of thematic or narratological concerns outside of tragedy. When these forms come inside of tragedy, that's when things get really interesting, right? Because you expect a paean to be about healing and about the doctor god, or about prophecy and knowing the future, and then a good playwright can ironize that and put that in contrast with the narrative that is being built around it, and that's where but yeah, like in general, I would say, like, when you're reading tragedy, it's really, really important to articulate it formally. Like, the choral odes themselves break up the play, so you have episodes, and the episodes are structured, and then inside of that, you have like moments when the playwright will flip into a musical form, and then can really start to play. And if you can see what's going on, like if the translation helps you, or if you can read the Greek, then things start to become really interesting. Like there's a moment in the Hippolytus where I don't remember if we talked about this, but this is one of my favorite moments. There's a moment right at the end of the Hippolytus where Theseus has received the suicide note. So Phaedra commits suicide and blames Hippolytus. Like, she claims that Hippolytus raped her and she's committed suicide out of shame. In the suicide note, it's a lie. It's not true. Something else is going on. But Theseus, who's Phaedra's husband and Hippolytus's father, gets the note, and he reads it, and then he starts to get worked up into a rage, which is in some ways like the right response to the note. If the note was not a lie, it would be 100% the right response, right? Mm-hmm. And as he gets worked up, he starts to sing. So like the more intense his emotion gets, the more musical. So eventually he's singing, and he's singing like, I'm going to kill my son. He's the worst person on the planet. Somebody bring me my son so I can bash his skull. And I forget what the actual words are. But at the same time, the chorus is saying, calm down. Like maybe we should ask some more questions and find out more about what's going on, which, by the way, is very good advice, generally speaking. And they're also singing. So it's a duet between Theseus and the chorus, and they're all singing. But the chorus is using rhythms. So you can't get this any other way than by looking at the Greek. The chorus is using rhythms that are really close to the rhythm of spoken Greek. So they're singing in a style that evokes speech. So the whole scene sets up, because of the way the emotional arc works, the whole scene sets up like a contrast between sober, like thinking, which is associated with speaking, and passionate, just passionate emotion that's associated with singing. And then part of the singing, the choral part of the singing, recalls speech in its rhythm. And what they're saying when they do that is, maybe we should, stop being so passionate and be a little bit more sober, which is to say they're actually the chorus is actually trying to pull everything back into the realm of speech. Right? Which is, like, for me, that is just so complex. Like, I could talk about that for hours and the different dimensions in which that works, and the kinds of contrast and play that's going on with that at that level. And I would love to be able to. I think it's not the same, but it is in some ways. It has the same kind of sophistication and compulsion of these moments in opera where you could have like three characters on the stage, sing, like all sharing a situation and all feeling very differently about it, and they're all singing about their perspective on the situation at the same time, and it all fits together into this like beautiful trio, this beautiful harmonious trio. But what they're saying, the contrasts are all the contrasts in what they're saying are all really different. And that there's this thing that happens in opera where you get like at the same time you get all these different perspectives happening simultaneously. That's very distinctive for opera and very sophisticated, and requires like a lifetime, I think, to get right. But I think there are things in Euripides which are not that exact form, but have the same level of achievement in terms of just what he was able to pull off and the way he was able to tell stories using all of his materials, including his musical materials.
I'm so glad we have some of those, or like, whatever form we can say that they were his, but like, it still is just so exciting that we have anything that was ever used in a Euripides play.
Yeah. And what's really amazing, about that is like if you wanted me to bet, and again, this is highly speculative, but if you wanted me to bet, I would say, so we have the pieces of music that are in Euripides plays. We have them because there was a notation system. So, and it was used in the Hellenistic period and the imperial period, so centuries after the tragedies were written. It was used occasionally to write out melodies, and we have a really good description of it. And so as a result, we can understand these melodies. That's why you can get recordings of them. But the notation system, I have my doubts that it was actually invented to write melodies down. I think it was invented to keep track of all the different scales and modes and tunings that people were using. So there we go back to Greece is a big place. A lot of people living in highly local places. The level of cultural specificity and isolation is higher than it is in the modern age. And it's really easy to imagine that the Athenians were making music in one way, and the Boeotians were making music in another way. And at some point somebody came along and said, well, what's the relationship between the music that the Athenians are making and the music the Boeotians are making? And they needed to be able to transcribe the music, and then set those things next to each other. And I think my guess is it's probably that was, there's people out there who are experts in music who are probably jumping up and down and yelling at me. Because it really is a guess on my part. And
I
sure
like guesses. As
but
long
like,
as you're saying they're guesses.
Yeah, like I really like the idea that the notation system. I mean, it's very, very intricate. I mean, it's not something that I could explain to you. It would take us some time to kind of work through, and we'd have to be looking at it. And, it's incredibly intricate, but it looks to me like the thing it's been designed to do is to relate different tunings to each other in a single space. Like, how do I imagine the commonalities between this kind of music and that kind of music? And so it gets developed for that, but then somebody figured out that you could also use it just to write out tunes.
Right.
And then it gets you, and as a result of that, we have these bits of Euripidean music that come from the, and that's cool. Yeah,
it's so exciting. I mean, the way things survive and why, and picking apart the possibilities behind why is one of my favorite things. So it's so fun to add music to that. I mean, this has been absolutely wonderful. I think I've kept you long enough. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm really so excited.
My pleasure. Yeah, it was fun.
Nerds, thank you so much for listening. As always, this is going to be short and sweet. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Pengowish is the Hermes to my Olympians, my producer. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much to Sean and Johnathan Churchett for allowing us to play this music. It was really exciting to have an aulos played on this show. And here's some more information about it. The first composition that I played in the episode was, and I'm reading from Sean's email here, based on the rhythms of Pindar's first Olympian ode, which had a triadic rhythmic structure, just like the odes in tragedy. And then the second piece I played, you heard Sean really teed it up for us, so we knew what we were getting. But just to reiterate, that was a new composition based on the ancient Pythian nomos, a piece that is supposed to imitate the battle of Apollo and the serpent that lived at Delphi. And in both pieces, the aulos player is Johnathan Churchett. He wrote the second piece based on a historical report, and Sean wrote the first. I am Liv, and I truly love this shit.